important to start with the fact that we are at the 50th anniversary of the Fungus Fair. Now, it's not the 50th instantiation of the Fungus Fair because we missed a few years because of COVID. But the Santa Cruz Fungus Fair was started 50 years ago. This is the first fair, I think, since the interruption due to COVID. So maybe you can tell. I don't know. We're a little rusty on how to do this. My background. Ooh, did I get it to work? Oh, I almost did. I pushed that button like 6 times already. Does anyone know how to work these things? My background with the Fungus Federation and with Santa Cruz is that I moved here in 2006 to go to school at UC Santa Cruz. I wasn't originally going to go to college, but someone told me there was mushrooms on campus, and I was like, all right, I'm in. So I came here and studied ecology and evolution at UC Santa Cruz. My first week on campus, I found out about something called the Fungus Federation of Santa Cruz, and so I walked down from campus to not to London Nelson, but to the Harvey West Scout House, and I brought this big bolete with me. And I said, does anyone know what this is? Because I didn't know anything at the time. And Phil Carpenter, who some of you have met out there at the ID table, took it out of my hands, and he took a big bite out of it immediately. Oh. And I was like, oh my God, who is this guy? What is going on? And he went, ooh, yeah, that's really bitter. That's awful. Oh. And that was, at the time, we didn't have a better name for it than Ben's Bitter Bolete, which we called by European name. And then like 10 years later, David Aurora and I ended up describing that species as Caliboletus marcia, so it has a name now, but it was the first mushroom I found on campus. Since then, I've been to, I think, every fungus fair, which always happens in January, and helped run it. So it's very special for me to be here for their 50th version. I wish that we hadn't missed the years for COVID, but I'm glad that we got through it. We did an online one for 2 years. So today I'm going to talk about islands, and this is an interesting topic for a few reasons. Everyone gets excited about islands because they're fun to be on. It gives you this very atmospheric sense of being in a different place, and this sense of difference, this isolation, this I'm not in a normal place. Something is a state of exception. Actually has real impacts not only on the fungi, but on how people think about the biology of fungi that's happening in islands. And as I'm going to get to in a second, I don't necessarily just mean ocean-locked islands surrounded by water, but islands from the perspective of the organism. Because what is an island for a human is not necessarily as unreachable to a bird or to a sea lion. And so different organisms have different thresholds for what counts as an island. So the way I'm talking about islands definitely has something to do with being surrounded by the ocean, water, but it also just has more to do with being hard to get to for the organism in question. So we'll get to that in a second. I come from an academic background to some degree. I went to UC Santa Cruz and then I eventually ended up teaching there. And in the course of being around academics, you get exposed to theory, which is structures of knowledge that attempt to explain what we expect beforehand, before we ever go looking for data out in the real world. And once you go looking, you determine whether or not your theory was good or bad, and whether it needs tweaking. And so what I learned there about islands, and about biogeography in general, which it's kind of self-explanatory, but biogeography is the study of where organisms live on the face of the earth. Fundamentals of island biogeography are basically pretty simple. They boil down to the ideas that you get species on an island in one of a few ways. Either the species move there, they immigrate to the island, or once an ancestor has arrived there, they speciate, they radiate. Evolution produces new species on the island as opposed to whatever the ancestor was on the mainland. So that's 2 ways of increasing the number of species that live on an island. Arrivals and speciation, radiation in place. New things occurring because of the island setting. And then you get losses in that total number by extinction. So if something disperses to the island and says, oh God, there's no food here, and dies, then you lose that species. But you also get things leaving over time. And just sort of that lineage doesn't necessarily go extinct, but it may decide to sort of redisperse backwards, and sort of you get a local extirpation. So that's how we think about, before ever going looking for data, how you get more or less biodiversity in an island setting. And so part of what I'm going to be talking about later is examining this from the perspective of fungi in particular. Who moved to the islands? And I'm specifically talking about California islands tonight, as well as a little bit about other islands. And then what happened once they got there? Did they speciate? Are there organisms that live on the islands that evolved in place there that aren't on the mainland? Okay, so we do think about species diversity, and some other sort of fundamentals of island biogeography is that the smaller the island is, the less resources there will be. And so in general, we expect, before ever going looking for data, that smaller islands have less species and bigger islands have more species. That's your rule of thumb. So that's what we call the species area relationship. And then there's how far the island is from a mainland. So the further the island is from a mainland, the less species we expect, because it's harder for anything to get there. This is all very basic, but starting with these theoretical frameworks helps us decide what it is we're seeing once we get there. So you might ask yourself, well, what about if the two factors are sort of inverted? It's a really big island where you expect a lot of species, but it's really far away. And now you're asking the good, complicated questions that make for good master's theses. So go, do it, figure it out. And it's unfortunately the case that you never get, a perfect series of islands that go from small to big at increasing distances from the mainland, and then one going in the opposite direction. We don't have experimental setups. You can't do experiments like you do in the lab for this kind of biology. So we just have to go and see what's up on these islands, sort of accumulate these anecdotes, tell little stories about what's happening on each island, and then over time get a sense of what's important from the perspective of fungi. What do they care about on islands? Is it really true that distance is limiting for something that can send spores into the air? Maybe they reach islands really easily. Maybe they're more like birds in that sense. But maybe they're less like birds in the fact that once they get there, they're missing sort of their hosts or the plants that they are dependent on the mainland. So maybe they're sort of a different thing. They're very not dispersal limited in the way that birds are, but they're also not as flexible in terms of making a living on any old bit of land out in the ocean. So those are some of the things that I go looking for when I visit islands. Endemism. So this is a fancy word meaning things that speciated in one place, so they evolved from some ancestor, and then they're characteristic of that place and nowhere else. They don't live anywhere else. And this is sort of what everyone looks for in terms of describing new species on islands, assuming that something evolved there that never left, stayed on island, and it's now indigenous to that island and endemic and characteristic of it. And so everyone wants to know, all right, you went to the islands, did you find any endemics? And the answer is they don't really know yet, because it's not trivial to say that just because you found something on the island, it doesn't exist somewhere on the mainland that you just haven't found yet. So it's always possible that something you thought was an island endemic will eventually show up in the mainland and say, oh no, I'm everywhere. You just saw me on the island first. And that's actually a real cognitive bias towards people doing work on islands. So when I said earlier that there's this sense of a state of exception when you're on the island, that everything is new and special and exciting and interesting, it has the effect of making people feel like they found something special and new and different when in fact they just failed to look for it carefully enough on the mainland. And that happens over and over. Okay, so we used to have this rule of thumb for fungi because we considered them, and when I say we, I mean sort of the academic community of people who study fungi, called the Bos-Becking hypothesis, named after someone in Bos and someone in Becking. I don't know who they are. They were wrong anyway, so we can forget them. But the idea is that they came up with is that everything is everywhere and the environment selects. And what this means is, what they thought is that because spores are microscopic, that they basically disperse randomly and evenly across the globe because they're so easy to transport by wind. And their idea was that all the differences that we observe about where organisms are has to do with the fact that those spores are all available everywhere. All the same inputs are available, but the environment is slightly different in terms of temperature, humidity, rainfall, soil, chemistry, whatever. And that actually explains the differences in organismal distribution. Since then, people like Kabir PA from Stanford and many others, but especially Kabir, have shown that this is not the case. That fungi are actually quite dispersal limited. Their spores, yes, they travel long distances occasionally, but generally they fall within 1 meter of a mushroom fruit body. So even though they can occasionally, in 1% of cases, catch the wind and like go up into the stratosphere and disperse across continents, that's like the exception to the story. Usually they're falling right next to where they were produced and germinating very locally. So they're much more like plants, or even something like a snail, where they're not crossing large distances. They're not like birds. They're not like mammals roaming on foot across the landscape. And this actually has a lot of impact into what we think we'll find, what we expect to find on islands. If they really are this dispersal limited, maybe we should expect that there's a much smaller community of fungi on the mainland, or on the islands, than on a nearby mainland, even if it's only separated by a few miles. So exactly how many, we don't know. We don't have a way of doing the math and calculating it beforehand, so we have to go see. We have to go tally up as many fungi as we can on the islands, whatever island system we're talking about, compare it to the nearby mainland, and over time we'll start to get a sense of exactly how much the distance reduces the inputs across that dispersal barrier. So I'm going to be talking specifically about the California Channel Islands right now for this part of the talk. How many of you have been to one of the Channel Islands? Which ones? Santa Cruz?
Santa Cruz.
Wow, you're all okay. You live in Santa Cruz. It's not fair. You're very parochial. How many of you gone to Catalina? Anyone gone to Rosa? Ooh, a few Rosas. Miguel? One Miguel? Miguel's, so I'll show you a map in a second here. But the way to think about the California Channel Islands is that they are an archipelago. What's another famous archipelago? The Galapagos, yeah. So it is sometimes said that the Channel Islands are California's Galapagos. Now, that's basically trying to associate yourself with greatness. But it is an archipelago, and it does have interesting things going on from the perspective of biogeography and evolution. There's amazing biodiversity out there. It's not quite as extreme as the Galapagos, because the Galapagos are more remote. So they have a more intense island quality. Ours are rather close to the mainland. But the way to think about them, for those of you who are unfamiliar with California's islands, is that there's 8 of them. So that's your starting point. There's 8 islands. And they're grouped broadly into 4 northern islands and 4 southern islands. And I'll be talking at first about the 4 northern islands, because those are the ones I have most experience with. And then I'll mention a little bit about the southern islands. Their most interesting biogeographic stories have to do with plants. So there's no endemic island birds. There is some endemic island mammals. There are quite a few endemic island snails, but the best studied group of island endemics in California for the California Channel Islands are the plants. So every island has its own endemics, and I think there's a couple dozen total across the archipelago. And for those of you who know anything about fungi, you know that if there are endemic plants in an area, there are fungi associated with those plants. So this is really exciting news for a mushroom person. If there are endemic plants, you can expect to begin with that you will find interesting endemic plants or fungi associated with those plants. The ecology of the Channel Islands is really interesting. Some of the oldest evidence we have for human inhabitation of North America comes from the Channel Islands. That's really interesting, because you wouldn't expect that 30,000 years ago, the first arrivals to the North American continent were like, I'm just going to cross 8 miles of water. That's where I want to leave my remains. Now, it's possible that the remains were found there because they experienced less disturbance than mainland burial sites. So maybe it's just sort of we destroyed some on the mainland that we otherwise would have found older evidence. But the point is that the islands have been inhabited by humans for a really long time, tens of thousands of years. More recently, like in recorded indigenous history, the Chumash were the main tribe that inhabited these islands, and they had significant effects on the islands in multiple ways. They ate a lot of the marine life, the intertidal life that surrounded the islands, but they also brought things from the mainland with them. They crossed this passage between the mainland and the islands in canoes, which is actually an astonishing feat if you think about doing that. The waves are not always easy in the Santa Barbara Channel nor in the Southern California Channel. And they hollowed out logs, sometimes redwoods, that had floated down the coast from big storms up in our area, and they would burn out the center of these logs, and they were called tomols, these boats that they would then paddle across, bringing with them things like acorns and foxes. And foxes have a really interesting story on the island because they're one of the most charismatic endemic mammals of the island. And I'll show you a picture of what the island foxes are like in a second. Okay, but two of these islands, one in the northern group and one in the southern, I guess both of them are in the southern group, are owned by the Navy, and they're basically restricted access, no public access, which would be annoying enough if it were not also for the fact that they are bombing ranges. The Navy, in its wisdom, decided that if we have an archipelago of incredible biodiversity and beauty, we should probably drop bombs on it. And so that's what they do, 24/7. And they're very excited to tell you that it's from the air, from the land, and from the sea that the bombs are sent. Submarines are bombing the islands, planes are bombing the islands, and onshore munitions. So if I go to San Clemente Island, the first thing they do when you arrive is, here's what to do if you find a bomb while you're looking for mushrooms. Don't touch it. But the point for the plants is that a lot of habitat's been destroyed. Sometimes these bombs start fires, and they burn through the oak forest, or they burn through the chaparral. So that is not the only kind of disturbance that the islands have experienced. Another thing that happened early on after Spanish colonization is that people moved grazing animals out to the islands because you could just leave them there. And there were no predators, and they were not going to escape, so you could just come pick them up a few months later. And they'd be fattened up for slaughter. So the vegetation of the islands was really severely impacted by grazing animals. And that probably caused extinction and extirpation of not only plants but fungi. And we'll never know. We have lost the opportunity to know what the baseline of diversity on the islands was like. Okay, so here's a map broadly of the California Channel Islands as well as these Mexican Channel Islands. They're like sort of part of the same group. They have similar vegetation qualities, but I have never been down to the Mexican Channel Islands, so to speak. They're considered in a slightly different biogeographic zone. I would love to get there someday, but I have to figure out what's going on up north first. And so I've just circled that top circle there. That is the northern four, the group of 4 northern islands that I have mostly spent time on. They're highlighted in this sort of darker green color here. And the 4 southern islands, this is not actually arranged the way they're arranged on the map, I just sort of put them together so you can see them, are on the right. So how do we think about what the islands are like? If you go out there and you're familiar with Southern California and you cross pretty much directly east-west over to the northern group of islands, and you're sort of attuned to natural history, you will probably say to yourself, wow, this feels like I'm further north than I actually am. Because they are a little cooler, they're surrounded by oceans, so the temperatures are more moderated. They get a little bit more rainfall because they're sort of exposed to the western storm track, and so they get a lot of rain hitting them before it reaches the mainland, and so they're a little bit wetter. And so I've phrased this as the northern influence. It feels like you're about 150 miles further north than the same point on the mainland right across from the islands, which means that a lot of mushrooms live there that don't live on the corresponding point on the mainland, at least as far as we know so far. There are significant differences between the island community of fungi and the mainland community of fungi in the same areas, as well as overall. So there are whole groups of fungi that are abundant on the mainland that are way less common on the island, and vice versa. So polypores, right? Easy to find. Turkey tails are everywhere on the mainland. If you go to the island, you see a turkey tail, you're like, ooh, a turkey tail. Because polypores, for whatever reason, don't seem to disperse as well to the islands. But the specifics of both of these are just general stories that I'm telling you. I don't have good data to show you exactly how much less common polypores are on the islands than they are on the mainland. And I would like to be able to. I'd like to be able to say the barrier to dispersal for polypores on the islands is of this strength or this intensity with every increasing mile from the mainland. That would be cool to know. This is sort of a look into deep history of the islands. And the point of this map is that the northern group of 4 islands that we know now was at one point in the Pleistocene all one island. It was one big island because sea level was lower. Sea level has risen, and it separated those high points into 4 different islands. What does that mean for biogeography? What does that mean for island biogeography theory? Say that again? Yeah, so at one point you could think of the dispersal to the big island as all happening at one point, and then the islands separating from each other caused another wave of speciation where the islands differentiated from each other. So there's two waves of separation that we can think of in this northern group of four. And at the sort of lowest level of lowest sea level in recent history, there was only about a 7-kilometer gap between the mainland and what we call Santa Rosa Island, which meant that really large animals could disperse out there, maybe not easily, but occasionally. Does anyone know what the most famous example is?
Grizzly bear?
I don't think there was ever grizzly bears on the island. Mammoths. So they made it to the islands. They swam across. I was actually at the Channel Islands Symposium earlier this fall, well, last fall, I don't know, in fall, the last fall. And someone came up with this hypothesis that the eastern-facing slopes of the islands were covered in a very dense, wet grassland that when there was onshore winds probably carried a scent to the mainland where these large herbivores maybe looked out. I mean, they painted a very poignant picture of like the trembling trunk of a mammoth, like, oh, I smell the lush grass to the west, and deciding to jump in the ocean and, doggy paddling across, or doggy paddling is mixed metaphors, elephant paddling across with a snorkel. They have a built-in snorkel. But they made it. The point is they made it. And so there are remains of mammoths on the islands that are still being found. When they do archaeological digs, they find teeth and tusks and things. But does anyone know this sort of interesting factoid about island evolution? What does it tend to do to organisms? One of two things. Or, yeah, something happens to you. You either get way bigger or way smaller, which is weird. It happens, so the island foxes got way smaller for a couple of reasons, but the elephants, the mammoths, became less mammoth. So they were pygmy mammoths on the islands, which sounds really cute. So the Paleopelago of the Northern Islands was about 119 kilometers long, 1,300 square kilometers. So just to give you a picture of what that's like, this is way smaller than the North Island of New Zealand. So even at its maximum size, it was nowhere near as large as some of the other sort of famous islands that we consider from a biogeography standpoint. System. Okay, so just to catch back up on how much smaller the island mammoths were, substantially smaller than their mainland counterparts. Okay, but a little bit about the island endemic plants. So there's some manzanitas, there's some oaks, and there's a bunch of herbs, so sort of non-woody endemic island plants. But the reason that I'm mentioning manzanitas and oaks in particular is that these are important plants from the perspective of mushrooms. How many of you know about the mycorrhizal relationship? So these are fungi that are in mutualistic partnership, tightly co-evolved, deeply in touch, in contact with the roots of a host plant for their whole lives. And these two groups of plants are famous for doing a lot of that, having a lot of mycorrhizal partner fungi. So when you learn about the islands as a mycologist and you say, oh, there's endemic manzanita and there's endemic oaks, that's exciting. You want to visit those habitats and go looking for what lives there. But this is slightly complicated because it's not exactly clear what is and what is not native on the islands for reasons that I sort of alluded to already. Some things are obvious. The pigs, sheep, the bison, definitely not. Those were introduced by people for grazing and hunting, and they have had negative impacts on the ecology of the islands. That's a fairly straightforward case. But believe it or not, some of these goats were so special that people wanted to give them their own status, said that they'd evolved within human lifetimes to be endemic to San Clemente Island, even though we have a record of who brought their first ancestor to San Clemente. So this was the San Clemente goat. There was a fever-pitched battle about whether or not they should be removed from San Clemente because people thought that they had some sort of claim to heritage on the island. And if you know anything about Catalina Island, this is happening again right now. There's a bunch of deer who live on Catalina Island that were brought there by people who wanted to hunt them, and they're having really negative impacts on the vegetation, the flora of the island, and the people who manage open space on the island are trying to remove them, but the people who live there, so Catalina's the only place that has a city. There's people who live there full time all year. They're apparently many of them are very resistant to the idea of getting their deer removed because they're kind of pets now. So there's a lot of conflicting priorities about how the remaining open space of the islands is managed. Okay, a few other things. Black rats. We know exactly when they arrived to the islands because there was a shipwreck and all of the rats that were eating the flour and the hardtack in the hold of the SS Winfield in the mid-1800s escaped. And so now there's black rats on at least that island. There are occasional reports of things like possums and raccoons getting into the barges that come from LA, and they see them escape on the dock, and they're like, oh God, now we have a possum. But usually they die pretty quickly because they're sort of disoriented on the island, but there's also trapping efforts. San Clemente Island has a lot of cats. Thankfully, the other islands don't have that, so each one has its own problems. But the complicated sort of version of this that I want to talk about is the oaks, because those were dispersed probably, some naturally, but some were probably brought intentionally by the Chumash because of their beneficial acorn producing qualities. So if they were on the mainland and they found a grove of black oaks or blue oaks that had really delicious large acorns, they would bring a basket of them in their tomol during their seasonal crossings and potentially set up these colonies of oaks that wouldn't have otherwise dispersed there natively. But they've been there for so long and they behave so natively, they're just sort of on the landscape, they're not spreading like wildfire, that it's really unclear how best to consider them. And like I said, the oaks bring their own fungi, so it complicates the picture for me as someone who's trying to study what fungi are native to the islands. I have to put an asterisk next to all of these things. Okay, so there are invasive fungi on the islands. Anyone know what these mushrooms are? Phalloides. Yeah, this is Amanita phalloides, the death cap. Very consequential mushroom for a lot of reasons. One of them is that it's probably the most clear-cut case of a truly invasive fungus in California. And there are two records for the Channel Islands, both on Santa Cruz Island, one from 2012 and one from last year. So it's not common out there yet. We hope it never becomes common because you've seen what it's done in the forests here. It's unclear to me why it isn't more common in the islands yet. Both of the places where it's been found are near human disturbance, so there's probably some amount of relationship to human activity that's spreading this fungus out there. Okay, last note about what is native and what's not native. Like I said, there's these endemic island foxes. They're little tiny things. They look like cats, and they're very docile. They let you walk right up to them. So my friend Adam took this picture of me, and I was looking for mushrooms, but I had to wait until this fox got out of my way because it was busy hunting snails. But these were probably descended from foxes brought out to the islands by the Chumash. Why? Anyone have a guess?
To eat? Maybe?
No, we don't think so. Maybe.
Pest control.
Pest control. So if you travel out there with a basket full of acorns and then you're living out there depending on the acorns and you suddenly find all the island's deer mice are getting into your grain stores, of acorn flour, maybe you get the bright idea to bring a few predator control, manageable predator control. You don't want to bring a mountain lion out there or anything, but these basically become domesticated small dogs. They run around camp, you feed them scraps, they eat the mice, and life goes on. But over time, they evolved to be smaller and smaller, more and more domesticated. They lost their fear of humans, so they're out in the daylight. They're descendants of the gray fox that we have here on the mainland, and if you've ever seen a gray fox, you know that the first thing they do when they see you is they scram. And they're out at night mostly, or at least at dusk. These are out in broad daylight. They don't care if you're around. They're clearly evolutionarily habituated to being around people. So there is good evidence, mitochondrial DNA evidence, suggesting that these were probably exchanged from the northern islands to the southern islands as gifts between tribal leaders, saying like, here, have a fox, a sign of my goodwill. And probably the southern island foxes are descended from northern island foxes. So are they native? I mean, they're definitely human-assisted dispersal, but they're part of the island ecology now. And in fact, millions and millions of dollars are spent managing their presence on the island as sort of like a core conservation goal. So whether or not they are quote-unquote truly native is sort of irrelevant at this point. We have decided that that's what human vision of the island is like. Okay, So like I said, there's a northern influence to the islands. There's a limited host range of plants, so fewer plants overall on the islands than there is on the mainland. They have suffered from a history of past disturbance, but there's also potentially this idea of a release from competition. So imagine that you're a fungus who, imagine that you're a fungus, just do that. If you can sort of picture what it's like to disperse from a place where there's a huge diversity of potential competitors, things that you're sort of attempting to live alongside in the soil. And on the mainland, that is a larger pool of competitors. And on the island, if you have dispersed there, suddenly you may have this effect that we call competitive release, which is it's suddenly easier to make a living simply by virtue of the fact that there's fewer other organisms drawing on the same resource pool. So we think that probably there are some fungi that are more common on the islands than on the mainland simply by virtue of this effect. And one of my goals is to figure out which of those fungi this applies to. Okay, so I'm going to start with Santa Cruz Island. It is the largest Channel Island. It's the tallest Channel Island. It has the highest point of any of the Channel Islands. And it's got a few different zones. So some of it is very low. Like I said, some of it is quite high at the highest points. But this is the only island that's really big enough to have an interior valley. So it's got a low, warm area in the middle of the island, which has quite different organisms. It's got more oaks that are more like interior oak savanna or central coast savanna. I guess the way I'm going to do this is actually just run you through the different islands. Santa Rosa Island is the second biggest of the islands. It's also part of the northern chain. And it's famous for having this big grove of Torrey pines. Has anyone seen Torrey pines in San Diego? It's one of the rarest conifers in the northern hemisphere, and one of the best groves, one of the best places to see them is right at the landing. If you ever go out to Santa Rosa Island, the boat drops you off right in the middle of these Torrey pines, which is amazing. Because pines have a lot of very specialist fungi that live with them, and I think if we're ever going to sort of get a sense of what lives with Torrey pine, it's not going to be the groves in San Diego that we learn it from, because they're often very dry, not good fruiting conditions. It's going to be from this grove on Santa Rosa Island, because they're big, beautiful, often much wetter than their mainland counterparts. Okay, San Miguel Island, I mentioned briefly, also part of this northern group, and it's a totally different story from the two that I just mentioned, because it's small and low and windswept. So those streaks through the middle of the island are sand that blows from the beach on the northern part of the island to the southern part of the island. And the scouring effect of the wind makes it so there's basically no trees on San Miguel Island. So we do have some interesting little experimental replicates going on here, because Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz are right next to each other, and Miguel is also right next to them, but it's totally different. It's tiny with no trees. It would be more interesting if it was the other way around, where if it was like huge and windswept and no trees, because it would provide an experimental control, but we didn't get so lucky. So we'll have to learn some of those validations of biogeographic theory by accumulating more evidence. So I spent very little time on this island, especially from a collecting perspective, but we expect it to have fewer fungi overall. There's less plant host resources, and it's just smaller and further away from the mainland. A lot of it looks like this. Herbs, shrubs, but no trees, and very little rainfall. It is a fairly dry island because it doesn't have the lift that sort of pokes it up into the clouds and causes the rainfall to happen. Okay, so the history of academic research on the Channel Islands is that up until 2012, there was basically nothing done. There was a community college professor from, I think, Santa Barbara, who had taken his students out basically for fun, which sounds amazing to me. I would have been stoked if I was a community college kid just going out to the islands and hunting mushrooms for fun. And he kept species lists. But they were species lists that he wasn't a specialist in fungi, so he just sort of said, oh, I saw some, I think, chanterelles, and I saw some jack-o'-lanterns. And so there weren't there wasn't a lot to go on. But I accumulated these, I emailed him, corresponded back and forth, and I've got records of these now. But in 2000, in 2000, Lisa Gravisha and Tom Bruns from UC Berkeley went out to the islands, and they collected specifically rhizopogons, these truffle fungi. And they were also incidentally taking notes on other stuff they saw, but not really in any standardized way. They weren't really doing a general survey of the islands. So the first time I went was in 2012, and up until then, like I said, there was very few prior trips, and there were very few specimens. There were no herbarium records, so you couldn't go look at actual specimens brought back to the mainland and deposited in a museum. Even more frustratingly, from my perspective, is that they didn't take any pictures. So I couldn't even see photos of what it is that they were seeing. But community scientists have really helped with this. So people using iNaturalist who are living on the island for some other reason are just out there taking pictures and sharing them on community science platforms and making it much more possible for someone like me to just sort of study the islands from a distance. While I'm stuck on the mainland, I can go see what they're seeing by proxy and add it to sort of a database or a list of what's out there. I want to briefly mention San Nicolas Island, which is way out. It is the furthest of the Channel Islands from the mainland, and this is a view of the entire island in one photo. You can tell that it's very low, very barren. It's very windswept, even more so than San Miguel Island. And unfortunately, because it doesn't have any elevational relief, there's no cliffs, there's no rocks. When goats were introduced to the island, they ate everything. There was nothing to stop them from eating every last plant. So when some of the first botanists made it to the island, they said, all right, we lost this one, there's nothing here anymore. They had basically reported that there was like one shrub left on the island. So the goats had really done damage. Amazingly, it has recovered somewhat. So this is a little bit desaturated on the screen, but now it's covered in this giant Coreopsis, which I don't know if you've seen it planted. It's also a horticultural plant, but it looks, I'll show you some other photos of it, but it looks like a Dr. Seuss tree. It's a sunflower that grows up like a little tiny tree and loses all its leaves in the summer, and then in the winter it just puts on this big green crown and big beautiful yellow flowers. But San Nicolas Island, despite being virtually sterilized, did have some cactus patches that the goats didn't get into, and in those cactus patches the snails continued to make a living. And some of these snails are extremely rare. They live only on San Nicolas Island. So I was invited out by this guy named Bill Hoyer, who studies the snails of San Nicolas Island, and he said, I think these are probably eating fungi. Can you come out and just tell me what fungi there are here? And just to give you a sense of what these snails look like, I can't tell this apart from a snail in my yard, but Bill assures me that this only lives on San Nicolas Island. And so what we found, despite being all the way out, it's like 45 miles out to sea, so it's really far, really small, virtually sterilized, all these things working against it in terms of how diverse we expected it to be. Like when I was invited to go out there, I was like, oh yeah, great, cool, sure, wonderful, thanks. Sounds like the worst mushroom habitat in the world, but I'll go, why not? There's still fungi there. We found 110 species in 2 days, and that really surprised me. I did not think that there was going to be much out there, and instead I was like scrambling to even keep up with it. I had a friend with me who was helping me collect, and I think if we'd spent more time, we would have found another 100, because we only spent 2 days. Some groups of fungi were really overrepresented, and this is interesting. This is the kind of beginnings of the story that we can start to tell ourselves about what matters for fungi in terms of dispersing to islands and continuing to live on islands. How many of you know the genus Agaricus? You all do. These are button mushrooms, portobello mushrooms. They're familiar. They like islands. Something about how they live makes it possible for them to A, get to islands, and B, make a living on islands once they've arrived. Does anyone have any sort of natural history guess as to why Agaricus are able to do this? Excellent first starting point. They're not mycorrhizal. They don't need a tree. They like there to be organic matter, dead stuff, but it doesn't have to be a tree, and they don't have to partner with a living version of it. If there's a dead shrub that's falling apart, they can eat that. If there's, any amount of sort of like rotting kelp even in this tide line, they seem to have a really high salt tolerance, which is really useful if you're dispersing to an island. What's another reason that they might be good at this?
Thick wall?
Thick what?
Thick wall?
Yeah, thick-walled spores and dark spores. So if you've ever taken a spore print off a portobello, it's like almost black. And that is because the melanized cell wall prevents UV damage. So their spore could float out there and just sit there for a while in full island sun and not experience the same kind of DNA damage that something like a tricholoma, which has the white spores, it's probably not going to survive if it gets out there. So Agaricus are good at living on islands, good at getting to islands and persisting once they're there. Same goes for the Antilomas. They've got relatively dark spores. Lycoperdons, those are the puffballs. You all know what happens when you squeeze a puffball, right? They produce huge amounts of dark spores, so they're probably also going to be good dispersers and survivors. So the general uniting factor of all of these is that they are, they've got qualities of their spores that probably make them good at dispersal and good at survival once they do disperse. That said, there are a few mycorrhizal species out there. This was under willow. So willows are one of the few mycorrhizal trees that live on San Nicolas Island because they can break off a branch and float out at sea and land in a little gully and reroot really easily. They don't have to grow from a seed necessarily, but if you know what willow seeds are like, they're that like fluff that floats in the air, so they can probably disperse that way as well. We don't know exactly how they disperse to San Nicolas, but they've brought some of their mycorrhizal friends with them. But I want to go back to that sunflower plant that I was talking about earlier. So there are virtually no trees on San Nicolas or San Miguel, other than the willows I mentioned. But one of the other tree-like things is that sunflower. It doesn't have true wood. It doesn't have lignin, but it does make trunks, and it does rise well up above the ground. You know, some of these, actually, my friend Adam and I had a contest while we were on island to find the tallest coreopsis, and most of them are like this. But we found one that was growing in a canyon where the walls were very steep and it was very shaded and it was reaching up for the sunlight, and it was like a 10-foot coreopsis. Very skinny, very narrow, virtually no branching, but it grew straight up, so they can get very tall. But this serves as a kind of wood. It's not true wood, it's missing the lignin molecule, but imagine that you were a wood-eating mushroom and you've landed on this island and you're desperately searching for something to eat. Perhaps this is what you key in on. Obviously, they're not going to sort of search for it in the same way that something like a mammal does, but if we think about selection being a numbers game where the fungi are there, they're living, the ones that are able to make use of this resource, even though it's not the exact same resource they use on the mainland, will be the ones that survive over time and potentially adapt and specialize and speciate. They become a new species. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of innovation. So on the mainland, you might have a certain host. On the island, you have a different set of available resources. And the idea is that you either adapt or you perish on the island. And so what we're seeing when we go out and visit is the things that have adapted. We don't see all the things that have gone extinct. We're seeing the sort of remnants of what has been able to figure that out. So here's what it looks like when the coreopsis is in bloom. It's hard to tell from this, but each one of those shrubs is like 3 or 4 feet tall. So it's a really interesting system. And if you look at the rotting trunks, you do find fungi that have specialized to eat this stuff. Ossicollis is eating this non-woody wood. I've actually been looking for a term to sort of reliably describe what I'm talking about here. It's wood that isn't wood. So non-woody wood is one of the ways that I talk about it. But there's also these oyster mushrooms that grow on these sunflower trees. And when I found these, I thought, wow, that is not like an oyster mushroom on the mainland that always grow on real wood, lignin wood. And not only that, it's hard to tell from, because if you're not familiar with the flower, but these are small oysters. They're like, they fit in the palm of your hand. There's never any bigger than that. So when I found these, I thought, that sure looks different. I've never seen this on the mainland. But I thought, maybe it's just growing on a substrate that's not very rich, and so it's just not getting very big. And so I thought to myself, obviously I'm vouchering some of these for the museum. I want to bring some back to do microscope work and DNA work, but I'm going to try and keep some of them fresh and bring them back with me to the mainland and cultivate them, because oyster mushrooms are supposed to be easy to grow. And if I grow them on a substrate that I know is good, and they still stay small, then I will know that it's not simply an effect of the substrate, but that it's actually in their genetics, that they are evolved to be small. And so I don't know if you've met Velany, who was here earlier. Velany is the former prime minister of the Fungus Federation. But Velany also works for Far West Fungi and is an experienced cultivator who does a lot of sort of like weird cultivation of things that aren't supposed to be cultivated. And so I thought, if anyone can do this, it's probably Vel. So as I was driving north, I called Vel and I said, hey, I've got a weird oyster mushroom. Can you meet me? I'll probably be there around midnight. So Vel came out in the middle of a storm and met me at a gas station. We did the handoff very secretively. And Vel took them back and inoculated some compressed sawdust and called me 3 months later and said, your mushrooms are ready. I said, oh God, are they still small? And the answer is yes. This is the oyster mushroom from the islands, from San Nicolas Island, grown on compressed sawdust substrate, and they were still only about that big. And they showed this really interesting feature, is they're a lot yellower than mainland pleurotus. Their gills are more distant. So all of these things combined tell us that it's probably evolutionarily quite distinct. We think it's a new species. There's a little bit of a complication here because there's something in New Zealand, funny enough, that also grows on non-woody wood. It's these New Zealand flax trees that are very tall, big trunks, but no lignin. So something about this group of oyster mushrooms, it and all its relatives love non-woody wood. And I'll show you another example of that in just a second. Okay, so in 2023, I went out there with a bunch of nerds to Santa Cruz Island. We made a bunch of observations. And it seems to be that Santa Cruz Island really is the most diverse of all the Channel Islands. It is biggest, it's got a ton of trees, a huge host range, a lot of resources for them to work on. So it validates that prior expectation from biodiversity, or island biodiversity theory. We expected it to be the most diverse Channel Island, and it so far appears to be. I was always curious, though, about Catalina Island, because it is also quite large. It has a ton of habitat, a fairly large range of tree hosts available. And I hadn't been there until last week. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a second. But I want to tell you first about some of what we found on Santa Cruz Island. How many of you know this mushroom? Marasmius plicatus, the pinwheel. On the mainland, it looks like this. It's red. But something that repeats over and over on the island is that there are different color variations of things that we find on the mainland. So we found this very light pastel pink Marasmius plicatus out there. And it does seem that for whatever reason, maybe it's simply that there is a smaller foundational gene pool, that there's more variation in color of fungi on the islands than there is on the mainland. We haven't really formalized that yet. Maybe it's just a story I'm telling myself that won't hold up, but I feel like there's something going on there. There's more chromatic variation on the islands. On Santa Cruz Island last year, we found this trio of species. So there's a funny story with this one, Liquoinosobi lenta. I found this on Santa Cruz first in 2012, and I had no idea what it was. And when we finally figured it out, it ended up being the first report for California. No one had ever seen this mushroom in California. And we thought, oh, it must be endemic to the islands. But then I posted it online and everyone said, oh, that's what that thing is. I see this all over the mainland. And the only reason that we finally got to figure out what it was is because I was on an island. I was operating under this cognitive state of exception where it seemed like everything was special and interesting, and I gave it the attention it deserved. And then it turned out it was everywhere. And it's kind of funny how often this happens on the islands. There's something that finally sort of the spotlight hits it. Your cognitive spotlight decides that it's worth paying attention to. So this complicates the search for endemics because of that reason. This is another one. Last year, when Santa Cruz Island was soaking wet, it was in the middle of an atmospheric river when we were there. And this little, really attractive purplish gray mushroom was under virtually every one of the island buckwheats. And I thought, slam dunk, finally, we have an endemic. And we went on iNaturalist and we found out that someone had seen it on the mainland, also under buckwheat. So even though it's really rare on the mainland, apparently, it's all over the island, perhaps because of competitive release. The things that prevent it from becoming common on the mainland are absent from the islands, and so it sort of is allowed to sort of fill out the niche or the ecological role that it inhabits a little more fully. This one is about as common on the mainland as on the islands, but the point of this trio is that virtually every island buckwheat, Eriogonum arborescens, the sort of tree-forming buckwheat, last year on Santa Cruz Island had these three mushrooms growing under it. It was really a super interesting niche to see. You could almost predict it as you walked up, say, I'm going to see these three mushrooms here. And it worked. And so I want to know what other island endemic plants have these sort of distinctive fungal assemblages. And what explains the differences in abundances between the mainland and the islands. This sort of group of fungi is sort of potentially one of the best groups to start with. You could actually do a study focusing just on these three to sort of limit your scope and maybe get an answer. Okay, a few other stories about what's on the islands. Here's a rhizopogon. What do rhizopogons associate with on the mainland? Pines. Pines only, right? They're like pine specialists. They're one of the most tightly co-evolved plant fungus associations that we know of, and yet on the island they grow with manzanita. This rhizopogon mengii, and unfortunately the islands are not exempt from climate change. the islands are sort of known for being cool and getting a lot of rainfall and being insulated from heat waves. And yet 2 years ago, there was a couple days of 116 degrees on the inland valley of Santa Cruz Island. And what that did is it killed a ton of manzanitas. So here's what they looked like when I visited the next winter. And this isn't just one patch, just to show you what the landscape looked like. All those brown spots are dead manzanitas. Even the gray ones, there are probably some dead manzanitas. But this probably means that this fungus is losing its host. So this is the kind of long-term loss that will cause this, primary extirpation of an organism, and then the secondary extirpation of its associates. That's how this works. Biodiversity loss is a cascade. Okay, so like I said, last week I was able to go to Catalina Island. In fact, two of the people who went with me are in the audience right now. And we were able to sort of get a first pass answer to our questions. What's out there? Is Catalina Island as rich, as diverse as it looks like it should be from a map? So Katie and Kristen were sort of crouched near this Artemisia, looking at this mossy, wet, grassy area, and found this minute little cup fungus, Rosiodiscus, growing on dead grass stems. And you might think, oh, that's cool, that's nice, except you probably don't have the context for what Rosiodiscus is. There are 2 other records of this for all of California. So to find it on an island feels like you're skipping ahead and you're going for something that you don't even expect to see on the mainland, and suddenly you go to a place where there's supposed to be less diversity, and finding something there is even more surprising. It's also by far the southernmost record of it. So the other 2 records of this are like in the Shasta, Southern Cascades area. So this is really extending the known range of the species by a lot. So every time we visit the islands, some sort of mystery or some sort of surprise rears its head. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited to continue going there. But like I mentioned, Catalina Island, here's the group of folks, just so you recognize them. It's really helpful. How many of you know Stu Pickle? He takes pictures of slime molds. Yeah, so he's there on the right. And him and Rudy, right next to him, sort of focused on the tiniest species. And I'd never really had a group of people so focused on tiny mushrooms come with me to the islands before, and that ended up being really helpful because some of the endemics associated with these endemic plants are mushrooms that are difficult to even call mushrooms. They're like little black dots, less than a centimeter long. But those are sort of Rudy and Stu's specialty. They like looking for these things. So I think the more that we get people focused on that group of fungi out there, the more we're going to learn that there actually are quite a few endemic fungi. They're just not big, showy mushrooms necessarily. So a lot of nights of, 2 nights of sorting a lot of specimens on the dehydrators allowed us to find things like this. So the opuntia, these cactus plants that are much more common on the southern islands, like Catalina, than they are on the northern islands. All of those sort of orangey patches around the spines, that's the symptom of a fungus called Philisticta. So it's not a mushroom by any means, and yet it's something that's part of the biodiversity, the fungal biogeography of the islands. Just like on the northern islands, there's special snails that live on these cacti, like I mentioned, that are probably eating fungi. And what is a cactus if not non-woody wood? How many of you have seen a prickly pear rot? What's left over? That sort of skeleton, yeah, that not real wood, it's not lignin, but it's quite a resource from the perspective of a wood decay fungus. And we found that same ossicalus that's on San Nicolas growing on sunflowers, growing on the old opuntia pads. So things that normally are adapted to decay wood are finding the next best thing on the islands, and they're doing this sort of ecological innovation. Okay, so I want to wrap up with a little bit about, I just want to mention that Hawaii, some of you are probably wondering, well, what's Hawaii like? The fungi of Hawaii are really under threat from invasive plants. So if you go there, there's now sort of an initiative with Jack Johnson, Lauren Ray, and Hart Singer. They're doing a lot of sequencing of what's left of Hawaii's native fungi. They're up in the cloud forests, usually in mossy areas, but down lower, it's being homogenized really quickly. A lot of invasive plants are sort of, you're getting a fraction, like probably an order of magnitude less fungal biodiversity than in the native forest. There was a paper published last year by Jeff Stallman and a few colleagues asking whether or not fungi really support what we currently expect about fungal island biogeography theory. And the answer so far is mixed, is we just don't know enough about fungi on islands to answer this question. There are some early indications that yes, they sort of fall into line with what we expect for other groups of organisms, but we need to basically have fuller species lists for islands around the world before we know the answer to this question. Okay, I'm just briefly going to talk about dry islands, like I mentioned earlier, because as you know, fungi are not limited by the same things that other organisms are limited by, but they may be limited by other factors, even more importantly. So when you think about the assemblage of the mainland of North America, you know that there's areas that are vastly different from each other in terms of how much available water there is. So deserts versus sort of more mesic prairies or grasslands versus forests. Here in coastal California is radically different from what you get on the east side of the Sierra. And those barriers are basically equivalent to oceans for fungi. They are the same kind of, they prevent dispersal. So for a fungus to cross that is, whether it's dry or whether it's salt water, it's almost the same thing. So when I have visited the Sky Islands of Southeast Arizona, I think about them in almost the same way that I think about the islands off the coast of California. They are remnant areas of suitable habitat for mushroom growth surrounded by desert. How many of you have been, wow, you really can't see this very well on the screen. How many of you have been to the Sky Islands of Southeast Arizona? What are they like?
They're more more mesic than the surrounding area, and more diverse. That's where you see all the cool birds.
That's where you see all the cool birds, yeah. You can go from this highway down at the bottom. So this is in the Chiricahuas in Southeast Arizona, and it'll be like 100 degrees at the valley, or it's not really a valley, but in the floor of the desert surrounding them, and then drive just a couple hours uphill into those mountains, and suddenly it's 65 degrees and raining, and you're surrounded by spruce trees. So it's like going 300 miles north in latitude in the space of just a few hours of driving. And the effect on fungi is dramatic. You go from desert mushrooms all the way up to mushrooms you'd expect to see in like Canadian forests in very close spatial proximity because of that island effect. So the reminder here is that not all islands are water-bound. The elevational gradient really matters because it produces changes in the vegetation, in the flora, in all of the resources that fungi tap into. So the question I often ask myself is, what are fungal concerns in terms of what makes an island from the perspective of a fungus? What prevents it from its spores reaching that area? Like I said, there is no perfect test tube island, although sometimes there is. How many of you know about, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, this island that was recently erupted into the Pacific, basically out of raw lava? So it's, I think, the only island whose birth was witnessed in human history. So it's like it went from under sea level to above, and we got to watch day one of dispersal. And that starts usually with seabirds. So seabirds begin nesting, and they begin depositing nitrogen in the form of their guano. Eventually, little things fall off the feathers or feet of those birds because they're dispersing from mainlands. Those can be lichens, those can be algae, those can be aquatic plants. And if there's enough nitrogen left by the birds, you begin this sort of cascade of succession. Seeds begin to sort of find purchase, and vegetation arrives. And so the question is, when will fungi disperse to this island? When will you begin to find actual mushroom-forming fruit bodies on a brand new island? What is the number of years required? Every island has a slightly different story. So just because we learn that some group is absent from one island does not necessarily generalize to all the other islands. And something that I recently was struck by when we were on Catalina is I was asking the island biologist, you probably only have one or two snakes here, right? Because on Santa Cruz Island, I think there's only 2 snake species. She was like, oh no, we have 6. And I thought, why do you have triple the diversity? And it's basically random. The dispersal of snakes and other amphibians, or not other amphibians, and amphibians from the mainland to the islands is thought to have occurred by rafting, where individuals get stuck on driftwood that is washed down from forests or chaparral during big storms on the mainland, and then it's sort of like they're out at sea for a while, and it lands on the islands, and they sort of slither away and make a living. And that is one of those 1 in a million events, right? It takes a long time for each one of those dispersal events to succeed. And on Catalina, they happen to get 6 species out of it. And on Santa Cruz, they happen to get 2 species out of it. And on San Nicolas, there's 0 because it's further away. And the point there is that the story will differ, and that one generalization from one island doesn't really hold true to all the others. So we're going to have to sort of investigate a lot of different island systems and see what the commonalities are before any of this is robust. It's really in its early stages as compared to sort of birds or mammals or even plant island biogeography. Another example of a mainland island, dry island system for fungi has to do with this species, Hygrophorus getzii. It's a snowmelt mushroom. So it grows in receding banks of snow up in the Cascades. So if you go to Shasta or Lassen, you might see this mushroom. But it needs a specific tree. So if its tree isn't there, it's not going to be there. And the tree is mountain hemlock. But if there's mountain hemlocks, it will find it somehow. So this population of mountain hemlock in Idaho is virtually an island from the perspective of the Californian populations of this mushroom. And yet, they managed to find it. Somehow, those spores disperse to that mountain hemlock. Now, for those of you who are clever about thinking about other explanations for the same data, what's another way this could have happened?
Transportation by car.
Yeah, but that's still dispersal. I'm asking for something that's not actually dispersal to an island.
A shrinking range for the hemlock?
Yeah. So imagine that used to all be hemlock and then it died out in between. So just because you have a snapshot that's present now does not actually tell you which order of operations produced it. It could either be that that's where hemlock grows and they disperse between patches of hemlock, or that hemlock used to be everywhere, died out in between, and it's just hanging on, relictual. So it's actually really hard to separate those two patterns, being that, we have 90-year lifespans to perceive the world during and go, what's going on? So a lot of this has to do with looking in the historical record, not that fungi leave very good fossils, and seeing if you can find a longer-term trajectory that explains this. So going back to the Sky Islands, something that is true of these islands in the deserts of the Southwest is that they have a lot of oak diversity that is not present in the surrounding desert, and a lot of conifers. And specifically, the oaks are interesting because, so here's a map of oaks and their distribution across North America. What do you notice about the middle of the country? Yeah, there's 2 big gaps that correspond with the prairies and then the mountains and deserts. But the east is sort of smothered in oaks. You got dozens of species out there. California has quite a few, nowhere near as many as the east. But if you're an oak-associated mushroom, what is the route that you're going to take from east to west if you're dispersing? Yeah, through Mexico. South first and then back up. For those of you who can't see it very well, there's 2 major mountain ranges that run north to south in Mexico that one of them actually connects to the eastern distribution of oaks pretty closely. So these are the 2 barriers preventing the dispersal of oak-associated mushrooms across the continent. But you do see threads of that, or evidence of that, in the distribution of oak-associated fungi. So here's this amazing bolete that grows all over the eastern US. It's never been found in California, and it's occasionally found in Arizona, and there's even one record in Colorado. Wait, is that Colorado? I don't remember where that is. It might be. But the point here is that the presumed route of dispersal is probably something like this. South through the sort of oak belt into Mexico, and then up the other mountain chain by just following oaks. You have to sort of have a maximum distance between different oaks for this dispersal to occur. If you look into sort of not particularly deep time, but just the Pleistocene, the era before sort of the human Holocene geologic era, it is probably true that oaks were more contiguous across North America, and there was a thicker belt of oaks uninterrupted across the west and across the south. And then as climate cooled, before our recent period of heating, that selected against oaks and they died out in between, and those barriers became more pronounced. So some of what we're seeing here is not about dispersal to islands, but about the dying out or the creation of that in-between habitat over time. So it's not always an easy story to figure out which one applies to the specific organism that's in question that you're looking at the moment. And then some fungi bring their own island. Swillis. So this is a mushroom that is very tightly co-evolved with pines. It's a whole genus. And it sort of seems like this is a study by, I guess, Tom Horton, who is an associate of Tom Bruns at UC Berkeley. But that these fungi enable the invasion of new habitats by the host that they need. So they can grow there first without being able to reproduce and make it suitable for the host to invade. And once that pine disperses there and grows up, then they can complete their life cycle. So the chicken and the egg problem also makes this a difficult question to answer. You would expect that the fungus needs the tree, but it's not always the same for all groups of mycorrhizal fungi. Sometimes they can arrive first and just wait in the soil and make it suitable for that tree to grow there eventually. And this has happened on the Channel Islands. This is taken on Santa Cruz Island. This is a little Monterey pine. Bishop pine, sorry. And all the fungus around it is called Swillis quiescens. And the reason it's called Swillis quiescent is a word that means lying in wait, very unassuming, is that it was found on the Channel Islands and described in the Channel Islands, and then people realized that it's really common on the mainland, but no one had ever paid any attention to it. So this is another example of that spotlight effect, that cognitive bias that makes the islands a confusing place to work from a geographer's standpoint. Okay, so what we need in the future if we're really going to get a good sense of what grows on the California's Channel Islands is access. Access is super challenging. And you might think that's a funny thing to say when there's actually multiple boat companies that run ferries out there all the time, but we tend to want to go out there at the worst time of year in terms of weather and boat cancellation. So our trip to Catalina last week got cut short by a day because the waves were too rough to run, and we decided to hedge our bets and not come back on a day that was likely to get canceled. And so we're often only able to be out there for a few days at a time, which makes it a really difficult to get a sense of what happens over the course of a whole mushroom season. So one of the goals would be to have sort of a crew that's living on one of these islands for the whole season, for 3 months at a time, the way that they have botany crews or mammal crews. We're not there yet, but we would need to look for funding to support that. If we can't do that, in the meantime, I would like for there to be more BioBlitz style models where 100 people arrive at the island all at the same time with some instructions about what to do, and instead of having a lot of time, we just have a lot of effort concentrated into a small amount of time. And that's really paid off. These past 2 times that I've been to the islands, I've taken a group of people with me, and I find so much more than if I was by myself. The first couple times I went to the islands, I was alone, and it really limits how much I'm able to get a sense of what's going on out there. I would like for there to be more graduate students studying this archipelago. It's kind of amazing that there isn't more focus on this sort of built-in lab that exists right off the coast of California. As far as I know, there's never been a graduate student or PhD student specifically focused on fungi of the Channel Islands, which is kind of astounding. Okay, so this is it, but I want to say thank you to the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden for having made some of this possible, Stephen Russell's Mycota group for sequencing a lot of our specimens, and to the Ken Norris Center for Natural History on the UCSC campus. If you don't know about the Ken Norris Center and you are a Santa Cruz local, please get involved with them. They do take students out to the Channel Islands as part of the field quarter. That's actually how I first ended up out there. One of their students said, "Oh, there's mushrooms here. I should invite Christian." And so he asked me out, and we found tons of mushrooms. But they are they've got a big community arm, so you don't have to be associated with the university to be involved with a lot of the events the Norris Center runs. They do a lot of old school natural history, not necessarily focused on cutting edge techniques or modern, more modern approaches. They do a lot of observation based and slow natural history that is deferent to the organism itself. They're a really good organization to support, and they're always looking for community collaborators. So do look them up if you're a local. I think I've run well over time, but maybe I can take a few questions and then let you go. Okay, thanks for coming.